Sometimes life feels so unreal that you find yourself waiting to wake up, like you're stuck in a scene from a movie that just couldn't possibly be real. That's exactly how Amy Vard, a young woman from South Carolina, felt back in early November 2015. At the time, Amy appeared in interviews on several local and state TV channels. Her words struck a nerve with viewers, who were captivated by her account. She shared how she had discovered the bodies of her mother and 3 other close family members, all of whom had been brutally murdered. "I knocked on the door, then walked in. It was dark. The TVs were on. I turned on the light and, that's as much as I can say," Amy recounted. During the interviews, her husband Ross Vard was by her side. But unlike Amy, he stayed mostly quiet, calm, even emotionless. Amy thanked the public for their prayers, support, and kindness. She spoke lovingly about the relatives she'd lost, describing them as wonderful people. She also stated clearly that neither she nor Ross had anything to do with the killings, and she couldn't understand how anyone capable of such a horrific act could live with themselves. Ironically, these very words would come back to haunt her, nearly a decade later. Before diving into the full story, we want to acknowledge the immense pain and loss suffered by the victims' loved ones. 4 lives were taken in a shockingly violent way, far too soon. Anderson County, located in the northwestern part of South Carolina, is a place known for its tight-knit community and traditional values. Being part of the Bible Belt, religion, family, and patriotism hold deep importance to its residents. But like any place, Anderson County has had its share of crime, from domestic abuse and drug issues to theft and, on rare occasions, even murder. Still, nothing had ever shaken the community quite like the gruesome quadruple homicide that shattered the peace in the fall of 2015. People who once left their doors unlocked now looked over their shoulders. And for Amy's surviving relatives, fear crept into every moment, wondering if they might be next. At that time, Amy and Ross had been married for just 1 week. They had a lovely wedding in Columbia, South Carolina, and had recently moved into a trailer on Refuge Road, in the quiet town of Pendleton. Amy's mother, 60-year-old Kathy Scott, lived nearby in another trailer on the same property. With her were Kathy's husband, 59-year-old Mike Scott, Mike's 80-year-old mother Barbara Taylor, and Amy's grandmother, 82-year-old Violet Taylor. Amy later said she last saw her mother on Halloween night around 8 p.m. The following morning, November 1st, Amy and Ross got up early and drove to a nearby town, Broad, to pick up Amy's 2 children from a previous relationship. The kids had spent the weekend with Ross's parents. They spent the rest of that Sunday with Ross's family before Amy returned home that evening with her children. Ross stayed back while Amy and the kids spent the night at the Pendleton trailer. Nobody heard from Kathy or the other family members that night. On the morning of November 2nd, Amy noticed something strange. Her mother wasn't out walking her dogs, something she did every single morning. Still, Amy wasn't too concerned at first. Since her mother lived with 3 other adults, she assumed everything was fine and that someone would have contacted her if there was a problem. Just to be sure, she called her mother's trailer. No one answered, so Amy left a message, expecting a quick call back. But when no one returned her call, that uneasy feeling started to grow. She walked over to the trailer and knocked on the back door. It was slightly ajar, which struck her as odd. With no response from inside, Amy slowly pushed the door open and stepped in. The trailer was almost pitch dark, all the curtains had been drawn. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she began to notice strange shapes on the floor. A few moments later, she flipped the light switch and came face to face with something she could never have imagined. Lying on the living room floor were the mutilated, bloody bodies of her grandmother Violet, her stepfather Mike, and Mike's mother Barbara. All had suffered both gunshot wounds and multiple stab injuries. It was a massacre, and Amy had walked right into the middle of it. Amy's mother wasn't among the 3 bodies she initially found in the living room. But less than a minute later, she stepped into a bedroom and discovered her mom's lifeless, blood-covered body. It was a devastating scene. Though the layout made it hard to tell exactly what had happened, it was clear the victims had been beaten, stabbed, and shot. Amy checked each of their wrists, hoping for a pulse, but there was none. She quickly realized all 4 family members were dead. In shock but thinking clearly, she picked up the trailer's landline and called 911 around 12:30 p.m. The emergency operator told her to wait outside until deputies arrived. According to Amy, her husband Ross showed up at the trailer just a few minutes after she made the call. When officers arrived, they were confronted with a crime scene that was more brutal than anything they had ever seen in Anderson County. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks or windows, and the house hadn't been ransacked. Expensive items were still sitting out in the open, untouched. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. Investigators briefly considered the possibility of a murder-suicide, but that theory quickly fell apart once the victims' bodies were examined. Each victim, Mike Scott, Violet Scott, and Barbara Taylor, had suffered multiple stab wounds and gunshot injuries. In addition, their throats had been slit. That indicated they were likely already dead before being shot. Tragically, that wasn't the case for Kathy, Amy's mother. The medical examiner determined that a stab wound to her chest wasn't immediately fatal. She was still alive when she was finally shot. Authorities knew that in especially violent homicides like this, the killers were usually not strangers. In most cases, the person responsible turned out to be a relative, a friend, or someone who had known the victims personally. This didn't look like the work of an outsider, it felt personal. That's why Amy and Ross Vard became persons of interest right away. As the closest living relatives to the victims, they were naturally under suspicion. Investigators didn't know the motive yet, but they understood that sometimes it only took a family dispute or financial disagreement to trigger something terrible. When officers searched the Vard's trailer, they made a discovery that raised even more questions. They found 18 firearms, 2 vehicles, and a staggering $887,000 in cash hidden inside a gun safe. What caught their attention wasn't just the money, but the way it was arranged. The bills were neatly bundled, sorted by denomination and year. This wasn't just a random pile of cash. It was extremely organized, and that detail mattered. It matched exactly how one of the victims, Mike Scott, was known to store his own money. Mike had been involved in buying and selling gold as a side business, and his relatives confirmed he always kept large sums of cash at home, wrapped and sorted just like the cash found in the Vard's trailer. However, Amy denied that the money belonged to Mike. She claimed that she and Ross had saved it over several years. But when asked to show documentation or proof, they couldn't produce anything credible. Investigators doubted their story. A deeper look into their finances made it hard to believe they could have saved nearly $1 million. At the time, Amy and Ross were running a struggling dog grooming business. It had been losing money, and their business space was on the verge of being repossessed. Both of their personal vehicles were close to being taken away as well. Things had gotten so desperate that Ross had written a post-dated $88,000 check to their landlord, promising it could be cashed on November 2nd, the same day the bodies were discovered. The only consistent source of income in the household appeared to be Ross's modest military pension from his time in the Marine Corps. But after the murders, Amy suddenly received an unspecified inheritance. She and Ross began paying off large debts almost immediately. On the very day the bodies were found, Amy brought her mother's estate balance, which had been $140,000, down to under $1,000. Even so, no one could trace exactly where the bulk of the money had gone. The murders remained unsolved, but the Vard's suspicious financial situation, combined with the sudden appearance of nearly $1 million in cash, made them look increasingly suspicious. Another red flag, the voicemail Amy claimed to have left on her mother's answering machine was never found. She had told police that before checking the trailer, she called the home phone and yelled into the message, urging someone to answer. But investigators could find no record of that message at all. As detectives continued their work, they began to speak with other family members and friends of the victims. What they uncovered painted a troubling picture. Apparently, not everyone got along. Several people said that Amy and Ross had strained relationships with Kathy and the others. In fact, there were allegations that Amy had at one point refused to let her children visit their grandmother. Over time, many witnesses confirmed that Amy Vard had been at odds with her relatives, to the point where contact between them had become limited or hostile. The autopsies revealed that the victims had likely been dead for several hours, possibly even more than a full day, before they were discovered. That suggested the murders happened sometime on Halloween night or the following day, November 1st. Ballistics testing brought another revelation. All bullets recovered from the victims had been fired from the same gun, and that firearm was not among those found in Amy and Ross's trailer. Despite the severity of the case, public interest faded as the months and years passed. Many people assumed the investigation had stalled or been closed. Amy and Ross quietly returned to their normal lives, acting as if nothing had ever happened. But the relatives of the victims couldn't move on so easily. They struggled with grief and disbelief, still haunted by the horror of what had happened, and still waiting for justice. While law enforcement remained tight-lipped, they never gave up. The investigation continued behind the scenes. What they had so far pointed to something dark and deeply personal, but the full truth had yet to surface. For years, people wondered if anyone would ever be held responsible for the murders. Then in 2016, the Vallard family filed a lawsuit against the Anderson County Sheriff's Office. They wanted their seized property, including cash, guns, and vehicles, returned. According to their attorney, investigators had thoroughly examined all the items but found no physical evidence linking them to the killings. However, the court ultimately ruled that the property didn't need to be returned. Later that same year, a shift in leadership brought renewed hope. Chris McBride was sworn in as the new sheriff of Anderson County. With him came fresh energy and a determined team of detectives, some of whom had been involved in the early stages of the investigation. Sheriff McBride and his team also used the media to their advantage, hoping that someone, somewhere, still held a piece of the puzzle. They knew justice could take years, but they never stopped believing that the killers would eventually face consequences. That moment finally came in December 2023, more than 8 years after the murders. Amy and Ross Vallard were arrested at their home in Columbia, South Carolina. They were taken into custody by local deputies and then transferred to Anderson County, where they were each charged with 4 counts of murder. They were booked at the Anderson County Detention Center. At a press conference shortly after the arrests, Sheriff McBride reminded the public that Amy and Ross had always been persons of interest. While he couldn't yet discuss the evidence or the motive behind the charges, he expressed hope that justice was finally on the horizon. He called the murders brutal and senseless, but said the details would be revealed in court. The lack of immediate transparency frustrated some reporters and family members, but the sheriff emphasized the importance of protecting the legal process and not giving the defense any more information than required. Amy and Ross's first court appearance came on December 16, 2023, for a preliminary bond hearing. They were sent back to jail afterward, but their attorneys quickly scheduled another bond hearing, set for February 14, 2024. At that second hearing, tensions rose when the prosecution revealed that 2 homemade weapons, known as shanks, had been found in Amy's jail cell the day before. Prosecutor Heather Weiss, from the South Carolina Attorney General's office, shared this information with the court. Amy's defense attorney, Lori Murray, pushed back. She argued that Amy shared her cell with 2 other inmates and kept her personal belongings on an unused top bunk. The weapons were found in a drawer, which officers claimed was hers, but Murray said it was unclear who actually owned them. Prosecutor Weiss took things further, stating that Amy had orchestrated the murders, and both she and Ross were a flight risk. Though bond hearings usually stick to matters related to bail, Weiss used this opportunity to highlight motive and financial context. She reminded the court that Amy and Ross's grooming business had been failing and that they were deeply in debt before the murders. Then, almost overnight, they had nearly $1 million in cash. That cash, $887,000, was found in their trailer, and it was organized exactly like Mike Scott's cash had been. Even more incriminating, some of the serial numbers matched bills known to belong to Mike. On the very day the murders were discovered, Amy and Ross suddenly had enough money to clear nearly all their major debts. Weiss said it plainly, the only people who benefited from the deaths of those 4 victims were Amy and Ross. She also noted Ross's military background, saying his training in hand-to-hand combat may have played a role in how efficiently and quickly the murders were carried out. She added that Ross still owned the K-bar knife he was issued when he left the Marines. But Ross's attorney, Sean Kent, fired back. He said using Ross's military service against him was wrong and misleading. All Marines go through that kind of training, and there was no evidence proving that the K-bar knife had been used in the attacks. At that hearing, several family members of the victims spoke publicly for the first time. Pam Scott, daughter of Barbara Scott, described how the tragedy had devastated her and changed her life forever. Tammy Taylor, Violet Scott's granddaughter, said that she and her family had lived in fear for years, not knowing whether the person who killed their loved ones might come for them next. Sheriff McBride echoed their pain. He agreed that the Vallards needed to remain in custody, regardless of the passing years. Despite the emotional testimony, the defense made its case for bail. Attorney Lori Murray argued that the Vallards had 8 years to flee, but never did. They stayed in South Carolina the entire time, even though they could have easily moved to another state or country where extradition to the U.S. wasn't guaranteed. To her, this showed they were not flight risks. Ross's attorney, Kent, criticized the prosecution's case as being weak and speculative. He claimed that in all those years, the state had built a narrative full of assumptions, but lacked the hard evidence needed to back it up. Like many bond hearings, this one grew tense. Both sides debated fiercely, but in the end, the judge ruled that Amy and Ross would remain in custody. More hearings are expected in the coming months. And while there's always the possibility that charges could be dropped, or the case could fall apart, that seems increasingly unlikely. Pam Scott may have summed it up best when she said, "There are still a lot of questions that haven't been answered." Fortunately, some of those answers may come very soon. As always, we encourage you to join the discussion. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. We'll continue following this story closely, and we'll post updates as new information becomes available. If you found this case compelling, be sure to like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss an update.